My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 34, and I've spent the last 6 years deciding whether children get to stay in the only homes they've ever known. I'm a child welfare compliance auditor for the state of Washington. Judges read my reports before they make custody rulings. Caseworkers change their recommendations based on what I find, sitting on a kitchen counter or missing from a medicine cabinet. My signature on a single page can keep a family together or take it apart. I know how to read a household in 15 minutes. I did not, apparently, know how to read my own. None of that mattered on the second Saturday of December, standing in my mother's kitchen in Bellingham, holding a printed schedule with my name on it, 11 separate times. You already know the drill. My mother, Diane, said, not looking up from the roasting pan she was scrubbing. Steam rose off the hot water and fogged the window over the sink. Christmas Eve setup, Christmas morning with the kids, cleanup after dinner, then bedtime through New Year's. We canceled Marisol. Marisol was the babysitter my sister Kaylee had used for 3 years running. A licensed, background-checked professional who charged $40 an hour and showed up early with her own snacks and a first aid kit clipped to her bag. She was, by any measure, better at the job than the family expected me to be for free. You canceled her, I said, without asking me. Why would we pay someone? Diane said, setting the pan down hard enough that gray water sloshed onto the counter. When you're available? You don't have kids of your own to worry about. You don't have a husband waiting on you at home. It's not like Christmas means the same thing for you that it does for the rest of us. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did. Standing in that kitchen, I did the math before I did anything else, the same way I'd trained myself to do on every home visit I'd ever conducted. 20 hours of unpaid labor, 11 mentions of my name, on a laminated schedule that had clearly been printed at a copy shop, not scribbled on the back of an envelope in a hurry. Somebody had planned this far enough in advance to laminate it. Lamination isn't a last-minute decision. Lamination is a commitment. My brother-in-law Todd wandered in from the living room, holding a beer he hadn't earned yet, since it was 11 in the morning and the game hadn't even started. Oh good, you're both talking about the schedule, he said, like he was walking in on something pleasant. Mason's been asking if Aunt Rachel's doing the sleepover thing again. The sleepover thing was what the family had started calling the 3 nights every December, when my niece and nephew slept at my 1-bedroom apartment. So Kaylee and Todd could, in their words, recharge before hosting Christmas Day. I had agreed to it exactly once, 4 years earlier, when Kaylee was 6 weeks out from a C-section and genuinely needed the help. No one in that family had let me say no to it since. It had quietly become law. My sister Kaylee came in last, phone in her hand, and she didn't make eye contact with me. That detail stuck. Kaylee had never once failed to look me in the eye in 32 years of being my little sister, not during our worst fights, not during our mother's divorce hearing, not even the time she wrecked my car in high school. She looked at the schedule taped to the refrigerator instead of at me. It's not forever, Rake, she said, thumb moving fast over her phone screen like she needed somewhere else to put her hands. It's just this year. Things are complicated right now. What things? Family things, Todd said too quickly, and Kaylee shot him a look sharp enough to draw blood. He went quiet and busied himself with the beer. I filed that away without a word. In my line of work, the moment someone says it's complicated and then physically flinches at their own husband, that's the moment you stop asking about the schedule and start asking about the file underneath it. I have built a career on knowing when a family story doesn't match its paperwork, on noticing the half-second delay between a question and an answer that's been rehearsed. My own sister had just given me both, but I didn't say anything else. Not yet. That is not how this works, professionally or personally. You don't confront someone with an unfinished theory. You wait until the evidence is undeniable, and you never let them see you counting. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who love you and realized, in real time, that they had already decided what your holiday was going to look like without asking you one single question, you know the specific kind of quiet that settles over a person in that moment. It isn't sadness, exactly. It's arithmetic. Your body starts doing the math before your heart has caught up. I did more of it that afternoon, standing at my mother's counter with a dish towel in my hand, because somebody had to dry the pan she'd just abandoned in the sink. 20 hours of Christmas childcare, priced at the going Bellingham rate for a licensed, background-checked sitter, comes out to roughly $800. That was the dollar value. My family had quietly assigned to my time, and then decided I owed them for free, on the working theory that a 34-year-old woman without a husband or children of her own had no competing claims on her own December. My work calendar, my apartment, my actual life. None of it counted as a reason. My father, Walter, said the only thing he said to me the entire visit, from his recliner in the next room without ever getting up: "Don't make this a thing, Rach. Your mother's stressed enough as it is." Stressed about what? Nobody offered to say. Nobody ever does, in my experience. The households that are hiding something rarely announce it. They just get very specific about which questions are off limits. I stayed another hour, long enough to hug my niece and nephew goodbye, and let Mason show me the 2 missing teeth he was extremely proud of. And then I drove home along the water, past the harbor, past the ferry terminal, already strung with lights for the season. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to vent, the way I might have 5 years ago. I opened my laptop instead and did what I actually do for a living. I built a timeline, not of my family's Christmas plans, of the last 4 months of small, strange things I'd been too polite to add up in real time. Kaylee asking me, out of nowhere back in September, whether my apartment lease allowed extended overnight guests. Todd mentioning at Thanksgiving that Mason had a school meeting coming up that he didn't want to get into. Then immediately changing the subject to football. My mother referring, twice now, to some appointment in January she wouldn't name, only that it was not until after the holidays. Thank God, said with the particular relief of someone who has been dreading a date on a calendar. 20 hours of free labor is annoying on its own. It isn't a mystery. Families ask too much of each other during the holidays, every year. That's not news to anyone who has ever hosted a Christmas dinner, or been the designated built-in babysitter, because they happen to be single. What made my stomach tighten wasn't the schedule itself. It was the lamination. It was the copy shop. It was the fact that somebody in my family had decided weeks in advance that my December already belonged to them, and had built a plan solid enough, in their minds, to survive me saying no. I picked up my phone that night and made one call, to a number I hadn't used in almost a year, not to my family. To a former colleague who could tell me, quietly and off the record, whether a certain kind of paperwork had crossed a certain kind of desk in Whatcom County recently. I asked the question carefully, the way you learn to when you need an honest answer, instead of a comforting one. Then I booked a flight, not to run away from Christmas. To be somewhere else entirely for the first December in 6 years. Somewhere nobody could laminate a schedule around me. I didn't tell my family yet. I wanted to see what happened when the free labor simply declined to show up. There was one more thing that happened before I left the house that day. One I almost didn't mention to myself, let alone anyone else. My Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, had been sitting in the corner of the kitchen the entire time, saying nothing, drinking her coffee in that watchful way she has at every family gathering. As I was pulling on my coat, she caught my eye, actually caught it the way Kaylee hadn't, and gave the smallest shake of her head, not agreeing with me, not disagreeing with my mother, just a warning, silent and specific, the kind you give someone when you know something you're not allowed to say yet. I almost asked her right there in the doorway. I didn't. Some part of me, the same part that has sat across from nervous parents in kitchens exactly like this one, understood that Carol wasn't ready to talk, and pushing her would only close the door faster. You let people come to you when the weight gets too heavy to carry. Alone, I'd watched it happen a dozen times in my job. I just never expected to watch it happen inside my own family. I got in my car and sat in the driveway a full minute before turning the key, running the day back through my head, the way I run through a case file before writing a final report. A laminated schedule, a canceled sitter, a sister who wouldn't meet my eyes, a brother-in-law who talked too fast, a father who wanted the subject changed, an aunt who looked at me like she was standing at a funeral for something that hadn't happened yet. None of it was proof of anything. Each piece, alone, could be explained away as an ordinary, slightly selfish holiday season, the kind every family has once or twice. But I don't get paid to look at one piece at a time. I get paid to see the whole pattern and ask the question that actually matters. What does this family need badly enough to risk making their own daughter this angry? I didn't have the answer yet, but I intended to get one before December 25th on my own terms, in my own time, without asking a single one of them for permission. Because here's the thing about being treated like infrastructure instead of family. Infrastructure doesn't get consulted. It gets scheduled. And I had spent 6 years of my career teaching other people's families exactly what happens when the person quietly holding a household together finally calmly stops. The Tuesday after the kitchen scene, I did what I always do when a case doesn't add up. I went looking for the paper trail, not my family's paper trail directly. I wasn't about to pull records on my own sister through my work login, no matter how badly I wanted to. That's the kind of shortcut that ends careers. And mine has taken me too long to build, to burn it down over a laminated Christmas schedule. But public court dockets are public for a reason, and Whatcom County Superior Court publishes filing indexes online, same as every county in the state. I didn't need my badge for that. I just needed a Saturday morning, a laptop, and enough coffee to sit through 4 hours of scrolling case numbers. My apartment smelled like the French roast I'd bought too much of in November, and the radiator under my window ticked every few minutes the way it always does when the temperature drops below freezing. Outside, the sky over the bay had gone that flat, bruised gray that means snow by evening. I had a blanket over my knees and a legal pad next to the keyboard, because old habits don't care that it's a Saturday. I searched Kaylee's name first, nothing. I searched Todd's. Nothing under Pratt either, not in family court, not in juvenile court. Not anywhere I had access to look. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. In my line of work, a clean search isn't always good news. It just means whatever's happening hasn't been formally filed yet. Or it's happening somewhere I can't see from a public terminal. Or it's still in the stage where a caseworker is deciding whether to open something at all. I thought about the appointment my mother wouldn't name. Not until after the holidays, thank God. I wrote it on the legal pad and circled it twice. Then I did the other kind of arithmetic, the kind nobody in my family knew I was doing. I pulled up my own bank statements going back 3 years and added up every unpaid weekend I'd spent watching Mason and Ivy, every grocery run I'd covered when Kaylee was between paychecks. Every time I'd driven 40 minutes each way to sit in a school pickup line because Todd had a shift and Kaylee had a headache. I priced it the way I'd price any in-home service for a compliance report, hourly rate, mileage. The cost of the groceries I never once got reimbursed for. The number came out just under $11,000 over 3 years. $11,000. Free. While my own apartment lease had gone up twice, and I'd been eating groceries on discount because I kept saying yes to a family that had never once asked what it cost me. That number sat differently than the $800 from the Christmas schedule. $800 was one bad weekend. $11,000 was a pattern, and patterns are the only thing that matter in my job. Nobody gets flagged for one missed diaper change or one skipped meal. They get flagged when the same gap shows up over and over, quietly, until it isn't a gap anymore. It's a shape. I called Aunt Carol on Wednesday. Not to ask directly. I've learned that direct questions make careful people go quiet. But to ask if she wanted to get coffee before I left town. She agreed faster than I expected, which told me something on its own. We met at a diner near the fairgrounds, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that had clearly been reprinted a dozen times. The plastic gone soft and curling at the corners. Carol ordered decaf and didn't drink it. She kept turning the mug in slow half circles on the table, watching the coffee tilt without spilling. The way people do when their hands need a job, so their mouth doesn't say too much. Your mother means well, Carol said, which is the sentence people say right before telling you something. Your mother did not mean well by it all. I know she does, I said, and let the silence do the rest of the work. Silence is the best interview tool I have. People fill it, eventually, if you let it sit long enough without rescuing them from it. Carol's jaw worked once, twice. She glanced toward the window, toward the parking lot, like she was checking whether anyone from the family might be pulling in. There's a meeting in January, she finally said. A home visit. Somebody's coming to the house. She stopped herself there, hard, like she'd hit a wall she'd built on purpose. That's all I'm going to say, Rachel. I promised your mother I wouldn't say more than that. A home visit. In my world, that phrase means exactly one thing, and it isn't a real estate appraisal. I didn't push. I thanked her, paid for both coffees, even though hers went cold and untouched, and drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel, doing arithmetic again. Except this time, the numbers weren't dollars. They were dates. A home visit in January meant preparation in December. It meant a family that needed to look, on paper and in person, like a stable, functioning household, with plenty of hands on deck for 2 young children. It meant a laminated schedule with my name on it. 11 times wasn't really about Christmas at all. It was about who would be standing in that kitchen when someone with a clipboard walked through the door. If you've ever realized that the people asking you for help weren't actually asking for you, they were asking for what you'd make them look like. You already understand exactly the kind of cold that settled into my chest on that drive home. I still didn't know what kind of case would bring an official to my sister's front door in January. Custody dispute. Welfare check. Something with Todd's job, or Todd's temper, or something none of us had seen yet. I had spent 6 years reading exactly this kind of file for strangers, translating fear into paperwork, paperwork into recommendations, recommendations into decisions that would follow a child for the rest of their life. I had never once had to do it for my own family, and I found out that weekend that knowing how the system works doesn't make it hurt less when the system turns out to be circling somebody you love. I booked 3 nights at a cabin outside Winthrop, 4 hours east, the kind of place with no cell signal and a wood stove instead of central heat, and I told myself it was a gift to myself. It was also, if I was honest, a test. I wanted to see what would happen to that laminated schedule with the one variable it had never accounted for quietly removed. I spent the rest of that week the way I spend the run-up to any real audit. Quietly, methodically, without telling anyone what I was actually doing. I kept a second notebook, separate from my work files, and I filled it the way I'd fill a case binder. Dates on the left margin, plain facts on the right, no adjectives, no conclusions until the facts were all sitting in front of me at once. Every family I've ever assessed for the state has taught me the same lesson. The people hiding something rarely lie outright. They just get selective about what they volunteer, and they hope nobody's paying close enough attention to notice the gaps. I noticed the gaps in my own family for the first time that week, and it was strange, almost dislocating, to turn a professional habit on the people who raised me. My mother had always been vague about money, but she'd never once been vague about a calendar date before. My father had never told me not to make something a thing in my entire childhood. He usually wanted things discussed to death at the dinner table until everyone was sick of hearing about them. Todd talking too fast wasn't new. Todd talking too fast about his own son's school meeting was. I drove past Kaylee's house on Thursday evening. Once, slowly, the way you're not supposed to admit to doing to your own sister. The porch light was on. Mason's bike was still out on the lawn, frozen to the grass under a skin of frost. The kind of detail that would have gone in a home visit report, as a minor concern. Unsupervised outdoor property in winter conditions. If I were the one writing it. I sat at the curb for maybe 90 seconds, engine idling, watching a shadow move across the living room curtains, before I told myself to stop. I wasn't there to investigate my sister's house from a parked car like a stranger. I was there because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to knock on the door and ask her the truth to her face. I didn't. I drove home, instead, past the harbor lights doubling on the black water, and I finished the notebook that night with the last entry I had. A home visit January. My name on a laminated schedule, 11 times. A dollar figure that had quietly crossed 11,000 over 3 years. All of it unpaid, all of it assumed. I closed the notebook and set it on top of the refrigerator. Out of sight, the way you put away a file you're not ready to open again yet. Friday morning, I packed for Winthrop. Wool socks, the good boots. A paperback I'd been meaning to finish since summer, and the notebook, because some habits you don't leave behind, even on vacation. I left my apartment key with my downstairs neighbor, in case pipes froze, watered the one plant that had survived my track record with plants, and loaded the car in a light snow that had started overnight and hadn't let up. My phone buzzed twice more before I hit the highway. Once from my mother, "Rachel, please call me. We need to talk about the schedule." And once from Kaylee, a single line with no punctuation at all. "You don't understand what's happening right now." She was right about that much. I didn't understand yet, but for 6 years, not understanding what was happening in a family had been the beginning of my job, not the end of it. And I had every intention of finding out exactly what my sister meant before either one of us said another word about Christmas. The cabin outside Winthrop had no Wi-Fi and 1 bar of cell signal if I stood on the porch and held my phone at a specific angle toward the ridge. So for most of Saturday, I simply didn't. I split kindling I didn't need to split. I fed the wood stove until the whole cabin smelled like pine smoke and cedar. And I sat with the paperback I'd packed and read the same page 4 times without absorbing a word of it, because some part of my brain was still standing in my mother's kitchen, doing arithmetic. I checked my phone Sunday morning, standing on the porch in someone else's borrowed silence. Snow squeaking under my boots, my breath fogging in front of me in the cold. 14 missed calls, 6 from my mother, 4 from Kaylee, 2 from my father, which alone told me something had gone seriously sideways. Because my father does not call people. My father sends one-line texts and hopes for the best. 2 voicemails from a number I didn't recognize, a Bellingham area code. I listened to my mother's first. "Rachel, where are you? Call me back. This isn't funny anymore." The second was worse. "Rachel, Marisol is booked through New Year's. Do you understand what that means? We can't just find someone else 2 weeks before Christmas." I understood exactly what it meant. It meant the $800 sitter they'd canceled to save money now cost double or triple to book on short notice during the 1 week of the year. Every parent in Whatcom County wants a sitter. It meant somebody, for once, was doing the arithmetic that I'd been doing alone for years, except they were doing it in a panic instead of at a kitchen counter with a dish towel in hand. Kaylee's voicemails were shorter, worse. The first one, her voice thin, "Rachel, please call me back. I need to talk to you about something." The second, 2 days later, no longer thin, cracked. "Rachel, the Whitfields might cancel the whole dinner if we can't confirm childcare. Mom is losing her mind. Please, I'm asking you, please call me." The Whitfields, I would learn later, were the family my mother had been courting socially for 2 years, an adults-only holiday dinner. My parents had been planning as some kind of quiet networking event for reasons that had never once been explained to me. Reasons I would come to understand a great deal better before the week was out. My father's voicemail, when I finally worked up the nerve to play it, was 4 seconds long. "Call your mother." That was the whole message. 4 seconds, no context. Delivered in the same flat tone he'd used to tell me not to make anything a thing. I stood there on that porch and listened to it twice, and both times I noticed the same thing. Not one voice in 14. Missed calls had asked whether I was all right, whether something had happened to me, whether I even wanted to spend Christmas somewhere other than my mother's kitchen. Every single message was about logistics, about what my absence was costing them. Nobody had called to ask why I'd left. I stood on that porch a long time, phone in my gloved hand, watching my breath disappear into the cold, and I noticed something about myself that surprised me. I wasn't satisfied. I'd expected some flicker of vindication, watching the schedule they'd built without me start to collapse the moment the one unpaid variable stepped out of the equation. Instead, I felt something flatter and colder, something closer to clarity than triumph. This was the arithmetic moment. Not the kitchen, not the diner with Carol, not even the $11,000 on my legal pad. This was the moment I finally understood, standing alone on a porch, 4 hours from anyone who claimed to love me, that I hadn't been a daughter or a sister to that household in a long time. I had been infrastructure, and infrastructure only gets noticed when it fails. I called Aunt Carol back instead of my mother. I don't fully know why, except that Carol was the only person in that family who had looked at me honestly in weeks, even if it was only for a half second in a doorway. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting. "Rachel." Her voice had a rawness to it. I hadn't heard from her before, not even at my grandfather's funeral. "I have to tell you something, and your mother is going to be furious with me, and I don't care anymore." I sat down on the porch step, snow soaking through my jeans, and let her talk. It wasn't a custody case involving Kaylee's own kids, the way I'd half feared on the drive to the courthouse, records that Saturday. It was Todd's sister, Melanie. Melanie's 2 boys had been removed from her home in November, after a welfare check went badly, and the state was placing them, temporarily, with a relative while the case worked through the system. Kaylee and Todd had offered to take the boys in, a kinship placement, which meant a home study, which meant a caseworker evaluating whether their household could reasonably support 4 children instead of 2. They needed to show a support system, Carol said. Backup caregivers, people the caseworker could call, people who'd already agreed to help. Kaylee listed you. The wind picked up across the ridge and I sat very still. Listed me where, Carol? On the paperwork. The kinship placement application. She put your name down as an approved backup caregiver, Rachel. Your job, your background. She told the caseworker. You'd already agreed that you help with the kids all the time, that you'd be available through the holidays and beyond if they needed you. She said it would look better with someone in the family who worked in child welfare, vouching for the household. I have spent 6 years reading exactly this kind of document for a living. I know so precisely what it means when a name appears on a kinship placement application as an approved support contact. It means a caseworker may call that number and expect a person who has consented, in advance, to be interviewed, vetted, and relied upon. It means a person's credentials, their job title, their professional standing, can be used to make a household look more stable to the very system that person works inside of every day. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had told me my name was on a state document at all. When was this filed? I said. And I heard my own voice go flat and careful, the exact voice I use in a home when I already know the answer, and I'm only asking to see if the person in front of me will lie to me. Early November, Carol said. Before Thanksgiving. The home visit in January is the follow-up evaluation. They need to show the caseworker that the support system on paper is real, that you're actually present. That's why the schedule, that's why Marisol got canceled. They needed you in that house being seen helping Rachel, not just listed on a form. If you have ever discovered that your own name was used on an official document without your knowledge, in a system you happen to know intimately, you understand exactly the particular kind of stillness that came over me on that porch. It wasn't rage yet. Rage would come later, and it would be useful when it did. What I felt first was the cold, professional certainty of recognizing a violation. I had spent six years identifying in other people's paperwork, now sitting with my own name typed into a box I had never signed. I thanked Carol. I told her she'd done the right thing telling me, and I meant it. And I hung up, and I sat on that porch step until my jeans had gone stiff with cold, and the light over the ridge had shifted from white to the flat gray of an early winter afternoon. Then I went back inside, fed the stove, and started making a list. Not a list of what I was owed, a list of exactly what I needed to see and who I needed to call before I ever set foot back in Bellingham. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at the small kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. And I let myself think it through the way I would think, through any file, methodically, without the noise of being someone's daughter or someone's sister getting in the way of the facts. A kinship placement application is not a casual document. It gets reviewed by an actual caseworker, cross-checked against actual references, and the people named on it are expected to answer honestly if contacted. If a caseworker had already called me, if there had been a message I'd missed, a voicemail buried somewhere I hadn't checked, and I had, without knowing it, simply not answered, that silence could read as a red flag against Melanie's boys getting placed with family at all. 2 children, who had already lost their mother's house, could lose a chance at staying with people who loved them, not because Kaylee and Todd weren't fit, but because the paperwork supporting them had a hole in it, shaped exactly like me. That thought stopped me colder than anything else had, all week. Because whatever my family had done, and it was significant, and it was wrong, and I intended to address it directly. I had spent 6 years of my career making sure 2 boys like Melanie's didn't get lost in a system that too often treats kids as case numbers instead of children. I was not going to let my own anger become one more thing standing between Mason and Ivesy's cousins and a stable home. even if the stability had been built, in part, on a lie about me. So the arithmetic shifted one more time, standing in that borrowed kitchen with snow ticking against the window. This wasn't only about what I was owed anymore. It was about doing this the right way. My way. The way I'd trained 6 years to do it. Instead of the way my family had chosen, which was to forge my participation and hope I'd never notice or never mind. I picked up my phone, found the signal again on the porch, and called the one person who could tell me, cleanly and correctly, exactly what my legal loose options were when your name appears on a state kinship application you never signed. Not to burn the placement down, to make sure it was built on something true, because my family hadn't just taken my time this Christmas. They had taken my name, my license, and my professional standing, and put it on a government form without asking, betting that I would show up and make the lie true, simply because I always had before. They were about to learn what happens when the person you build your paperwork around finally reads the file for herself. I called the caseworker on Melanie's case first, before I called anyone in my family. Her name was Denise Okafor, and I introduced myself the way I introduce myself in every professional call I make. Full name, credentials, the state office I work for, because I needed her to understand exactly who was on the line before I told her what I'd learned. I told her the truth, that my name had been listed on the kinship placement application without my knowledge or consent, that I had not agreed to serve as a backup caregiver, had never been contacted for a reference interview, and had only learned of the filing secondhand from a relative. I told her I still wanted the boys placed with family if the household could genuinely support them. That part was true, and I meant it. But that the application needed to reflect who had actually agreed to what, not who my sister had assumed would go along with it. Denise was quiet for a moment, then said what I already knew she'd say. That's a significant discrepancy. I'll need to follow up directly with your sister before the January visit. Good, I told her. That's exactly what needs to happen. I drove back to Bellingham on the 23rd, 4 hours with the radio off, rehearsing nothing, because I'd learned a long time ago in this job that rehearsed confrontations rarely survive contact with an actual room full of people defending themselves. I went straight to my parents' house, instead of my own apartment, walked in without knocking the way I'd done my whole life, and found all of them there. My mother mid-panic over a grocery list, Kaylee at the table with Todd. My father in his recliner with the television off for once, which told me they'd been arguing before I arrived. You're back, my mother said, and something in her face tried for relief before it landed somewhere closer to alarm. I talked to Denise Okafor this morning, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Melanie's caseworker, the one reviewing the kinship placement for Mason's cousins. The room went still in a way I recognized from 100 home visits. Kaylee's hand found Todd's arm. My mother set the grocery list down very carefully, like it might break. Rachel, Kaylee started. You listed me as an approved backup caregiver on a state application in November, I said, without asking me. You told a caseworker I'd already agreed. You built a home visit schedule around making that lie look true, and you canceled a licensed sitter to do it. I need you to understand that's not favor asking. In my field, that has a name. It's misrepresentation on a state document. And if I hadn't caught it, it could have gotten those boys' placement denied when the real problem gets discovered later instead of now. My mother's face did something I hadn't seen it do in years. It went from defensive to genuinely frightened. And for a second, I understood that some of what she'd built this Christmas around wasn't only about looking good for the Whitfields. She was terrified of losing those boys' placement, terrified of what it would do to Todd's family, and she had solved that fear the only way she knew how, which was to spend someone else's time and someone else's name without asking, the way she'd always solved problems that required more than she had to give herself. We didn't think you'd say no, Kaylee said, and her voice cracked on the last word. You never say no, Rachel. You never have. I thought it would just be easier if it was already handled by the time you found out. That's the problem, I said. You didn't think I'd say no. You've never once had to consider the possibility. Because I've spent 32 years making it easy for you not to. That's not the same as me agreeing. It never was. My father spoke then, from the recliner, quieter than I'd ever heard him. We should have asked you. 4 words. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was the first true sentence he'd said to me all season, and something in my chest loosened slightly hearing it. Even though I knew 4 words weren't going to undo $11,000 of unpaid Christmases, or one very real government form with my name typed into a box I'd never signed. I told them what would happen next, plainly, the way I'd tell any family the terms of a case plan. Denise would be calling Kaylee directly to correct the record. If Kaylee and Todd wanted me listed as an actual support contact for the boys, not a Christmas schedule, an actual, ongoing arrangement, I was willing to discuss it, on paper, with real terms, the same way I'd expect any professional relationship to work. Not because I was punishing them. Because those 2 boys deserved a placement built on something true, and because I was done being a resource. Nobody had to ask permission to use. Todd, who had said almost nothing the entire conversation, finally spoke, staring at his own hands instead of at me. I told Kaylee we should ask you first. Back in November, I said it felt wrong. He looked up, and for the first time all season, I saw something that looked like genuine shame on his face, instead of the fast, deflecting talk I'd gotten used to from him. I let it happen anyway, because it was easier than the fight. I'm not proud of that. I appreciated the honesty more than I expected to. It didn't erase anything, but it told me something useful, that the plan hadn't been unanimous, that at least one person in that house had felt the wrongness of it and swallowed the objection anyway. The way people do when saying nothing feels safer than saying no. I understood that impulse better than anyone in that room. I'd been swallowing objections in that family for 32 years. And the Whitfield dinner, my mother said, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in a long time. Rachel, I don't even know what to do about the dinner now. I don't either, I said, and I meant it kindly, which surprised both of us. But that's yours to solve, Mom. It was never mine to begin with. I didn't storm out. I stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to hug Mason, when Kaylee brought the kids by to pick up a forgotten toy, long enough to watch my mother's hands shake slightly around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, long enough to see Aunt Carol, who'd arrived sometime during the conversation, and stood quietly by the doorway the entire time, catch my eye one more time and give the smallest nod, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that the truth had finally made it into the room where it belonged. Before I left, my mother followed me to the door, the way she used to, when I was a teenager, sneaking out to meet friends she didn't approve of. I need you to know, she said, arms crossed tight against the cold coming through the open door, that I never meant to hurt you. I was scared for those boys. I panicked, and panicking makes people do the wrong thing for what feels like the right reason. I stood there a moment, considering it, because I've learned in my job that fear and manipulation can wear the exact same clothes, and it takes real work to tell them apart. I believe you were scared, I said finally. I don't think that's the same thing as it being okay. You can be scared and still owe someone an apology for what you did while you were scared. Both things are true at once. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect her to. Some sentences aren't meant to be answered right away. They're meant to sit with a person until they've earned the right to respond to them, honestly. And my mother wasn't there yet. I wasn't sure she ever would be. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, that uncertainty didn't feel like my responsibility to fix. Then I left, and I drove to my own apartment, and I spent Christmas Eve exactly the way I'd planned to before any of this started. Quietly, on my own terms, with a fire I built myself and a phone I only answered when I chose to. Denise called Kaylee 2 days after Christmas. I don't know everything that was said, only that the placement went forward in January with an honest support plan. My name removed from the parts I hadn't agreed to, and added back, properly this time, to the one piece I chose to take on. 2 Saturdays a month with Melanie's boys, in writing, with an actual conversation behind it, instead of an assumption. The home visit happened on schedule, and it went fine. Better than fine, Denise told me later, because for once the paperwork actually matched the household, instead of describing one my family had staged for a single afternoon. Mason and Ivy's cousins got their home. My sister got a harder lesson than a laminated schedule ever could have taught her. And I got something I hadn't expected to get out of any of this. The first Christmas in 6 years, where every hour I gave to my family, I gave because I chose to, not because nobody had ever bothered to ask. Kaylee and I talked again. In February, over coffee this time, not a diner near the fairgrounds, but a quiet place near my apartment. And she said something I've turned over in my head since. I think I convinced myself that, because you never said no, you must have been okay with all of it. I told her that's exactly the mistake. The one worth remembering longer than any one Christmas. Silence isn't the same as consent, and love doesn't give anyone the right to stop asking. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you've made it this far. Families don't run on love alone. They run on the assumption that some people will always say yes, and that assumption gets mistaken. Generation after generation, for what love actually looks like. Kindness is a gift you choose to give. Permission is something someone has to actually ask you for. My family had spent years treating the first as though it automatically included the second, and it took a laminated Christmas schedule, an $11,000 tally, and my own name on a government form to make any of us see the difference. If someone in your life has ever assumed your silence meant agreement, I want to hear about it in the comments. What did it take for you to finally say the words out loud? And if this story felt familiar, you know what to do. Subscribe, because there are more families like mine waiting to learn the same lesson I did. One laminated schedule at a time.